Gates of Imagination presents The Black Stranger by Robert E. Howard. This title was chosen to be recorded by our patrons. If you would like to participate in nominating future titles that will appear on our channel, become our patron on YouTube. Chapter 1. The Painted Men. One moment, the glade lay empty. The next, a man stood poised warily at the edge of the bushes. There had been no sound to warn the gray squirrels of his coming, but the gay-hued birds that flitted about in the sunshine of the open space took fright at his sudden appearance and rose in a clamoring cloud. The man scowled and glanced quickly back the way he had come, as if fearing their flight had betrayed his position to someone unseen. Then he stalked across the glade, placing his feet with care. For all his massive muscular build, he moved with the supple certitude of a panther. He was naked, except for a rag twisted about his loins, and his limbs were crisscrossed with scratches from briars and caked with dried mud. A brown-crusted bandage was knotted about his thickly muscled left arm. Under his matted black mane, his face was drawn and gaunt, and his eyes burned like the eyes of a wounded panther. He limped slightly as he followed the dim path that led across the open space. Halfway across the glade, he stopped short and whirled, cat-like, facing back the way he had come, as a long-drawn call quavered out across the forest. To another man, it would have seemed merely the howl of a wolf. But this man knew it was no wolf. He was a Cimmerian and understood the voices of the wilderness as a city. Bred man understands the voices of his friends. Rage burned redly in his bloodshot eyes as he turned once more and hurried along the path, which, as it left the glade, ran along the edge of a dense thicket that rose in a solid clump of greenery among the trees and bushes. A massive log, deeply embedded in the grassy earth, paralleled the fringe of the thicket, lying between it and the path. When the Cimmerian saw this log, he halted and looked back across the glade. To the average eye, there were no signs to show that he had passed, but there was evidence visible to his wilderness-sharpened eyes, and therefore to the equally keen eyes of those who pursued him. He snarled silently, the red rage growing in his eyes, the berserk fury of a hunted beast which is ready to turn at bay. He walked down the trail with comparative carelessness, here and there crushing a grass blade beneath his foot. Then, when he had reached the further end of the great log, he sprang upon it, turned, and ran lightly back along it. The bark had long been worn away by the elements. He left no sign to show the keenest forest eyes that he had doubled on his trail. When he reached the densest point of the thicket, he faded into it like a shadow, with hardly the quiver of a leaf to mark his passing. The minutes dragged. The gray squirrels chattered again on the branches, then flattened their bodies and were suddenly mute. Again the glade was invaded. As silently as the first man had appeared, 3 other men materialized out of the eastern edge of the clearing. They were dark-skinned men of short stature, with thickly muscled chests and arms. They wore beaded buckskin loincloths, and an eagle's feather was thrust into each black mane. They were painted in hideous designs and heavily armed. They had scanned the glade carefully before showing themselves in the open, for they moved out of the bushes without hesitation, in close single file, treading as softly as leopards and bending down to stare at the path. They were following the trail of the Cimmerian, but it was no easy task even for these human bloodhounds. They moved slowly across the glade, and then one stiffened, grunted, and pointed with his broad-bladed stabbing spear at a crushed grass blade where the path entered the forest again. All halted instantly, and their beady black eyes quested the forest walls. But their quarry was well hidden. They saw nothing to awake their suspicion, and presently they moved on, more rapidly, following the faint marks that seemed to indicate their prey was growing careless through weakness or desperation. They had just passed the spot where the thicket crowded closest to the ancient trail, when the Cimmerian bounded into the path behind them and plunged his knife between the shoulders of the last man. The attack was so quick and unexpected, the Pict had no chance to save himself. The blade was in his heart before he knew he was in peril. The other two whirled with the instant steel-trap quickness of savages. But even as his knife sank home, the Cimmerian struck a tremendous blow with the war axe in his right hand. The second Pict was in the act of turning as the axe fell. It split his skull to the teeth. The remaining Pict, a chief by the scarlet tip of his eagle feather, came savagely to the attack. He was stabbing at the Cimmerian's breast, even as the killer wrenched his axe from the dead man's head. The Cimmerian hurled the body against the chief and followed with an attack as furious and desperate as the charge of a wounded tiger. The Pict, staggering under the impact of the corpse against him, made no attempt to parry the dripping axe, the instinct to slay submerging even the instinct to live. He drove his spear ferociously at his enemy's broad breast. The Cimmerian had the advantage of a greater intelligence and a weapon in each hand. The hatchet, checking its downward sweep, struck the spear aside, and the knife in the Cimmerian's left hand ripped upward into the painted belly. An awful howl burst from the Pict's lips as he crumpled, disemboweled, a cry not of fear or of pain, but of baffled bestial fury, the death screech of a panther. It was answered by a wild chorus of yells some distance east of the glade. The Cimmerian started convulsively, wheeled, crouching like a wild thing at bay, lips a-snarl, shaking the sweat from his face. Blood trickled down his forearm from under the bandage. With a gasping, incoherent imprecation, he turned and fled westward. He did not pick his way now, but ran with all the speed of his long legs, calling on the deep and all but inexhaustible reservoirs of endurance, which are nature's compensation for a barbaric existence. Behind him for a space, the woods were silent. Then a demoniacal howling burst out at the spot he had recently left, and he knew his pursuers had found the bodies of his victims. He had no breath for cursing the blood drops that kept spilling to the ground from his freshly opened wound, leaving a trail a child could follow. He had thought that perhaps these 3 Picts were all that still pursued him of the war party which had followed him for over 100 miles. But he might have known these human wolves never quit a blood trail. The woods were silent again, and that meant they were racing after him, marking his path by the betraying blood drops he could not check. A wind out of the west blew against his face, laden with a salty dampness he recognized. Dully, he was amazed. If he was that close to the sea, the long chase had been even longer than he had realized, but it was nearly over. Even his wolfish vitality was ebbing under the terrible strain. He gasped for breath, and there was a sharp pain in his side. His legs trembled with weariness, and the lame one ached like the cut of a knife in the tendons each time he set the foot to earth. He had followed the instincts of the wilderness which bred him, straining every nerve and sinew, exhausting every subtlety and artifice to survive. Now, in his extremity, he was obeying another instinct, looking for a place to turn at bay and sell his life at a bloody price. He did not leave the trail for the tangled depths on either hand. He knew that it was futile to hope to evade his pursuers now. He ran on down the trail while the blood pounded louder and louder in his ears, and each breath he drew was a racking, dry-lipped gulp. Behind him, a mad baying broke out, token that they were close on his heels and expected to overhaul their prey swiftly. They would come as fleet as starving wolves now, howling at every leap. Abruptly, he burst from the denseness of the trees and saw ahead of him the ground pitching upward and the ancient trail winding up rocky ledges between jagged boulders. All swam before him in a dizzy red mist, but it was a hill he had come to, a rugged crag rising abruptly from the forest about its foot, and the dim trail wound up to a broad ledge near the summit. That ledge would be as good a place to die as any. He limped up the trail, going on hands and knees in the steeper places, his knife between his teeth. He had not yet reached the jutting ledge when some 40 painted savages broke from among the trees, howling like wolves. At the sight of their prey, their screams rose to a devil's crescendo, and they raced toward the foot of the crag, loosing arrows as they came. The shafts showered about the man, who doggedly climbed upward, and one stuck in the calf of his leg. Without pausing in his climb, he tore it out and threw it aside, heedless of the less accurate missiles which splintered on the rocks about him. Grimly, he hauled himself over the rim of the ledge and turned about, drawing his hatchet and shifting knife to hand. He lay glaring down at his pursuers over the rim, only his shock of hair and blazing eyes visible. His chest heaved as he drank in the air in great shuddering gasps, and he clenched his teeth against a tendency toward nausea. Only a few arrows whistled up at him. The horde knew its prey was cornered. The warriors came on howling, leaping agilely over the rocks at the foot of the hill, war axes in their hand. The first to reach the crag was a brawny brave whose eagle feather was stained scarlet as a token of chieftainship. He halted briefly, one foot on the sloping trail, arrow notched and drawn halfway back, head thrown back, and lips parted for an exultant yell. But the shaft was never loosed. He froze into motionlessness, and the bloodlust in his black eyes gave way to a look of startled recognition. With a whoop, he gave back, throwing his arms wide to check the rush of his howling braves. The man crouching on the ledge above them understood the Pictish tongue, but he was too far away to catch the significance of the staccato phrases snapped at the warriors by the crimson-feathered chief. But all ceased their yelping and stood mutely staring up, not at the man on the ledge, it seemed to him, but at the hill itself. Then, without further hesitation, they unstrung their bows and thrust them into buckskin cases at their girdles, turned their backs, and trotted across the open space to melt into the forest without a backward look. The Cimmerian glared in amazement. He knew the Pictish nature too well not to recognize the finality expressed in the departure. He knew they would not come back. They were heading for their villages, 100 miles to the east. But he could not understand it. What was there about his refuge that would cause a Pictish war party to abandon a chase it had followed so long with all the passion of hungry wolves? He knew there were sacred places, spots set aside as sanctuaries by the various clans, and that a fugitive, taking refuge in one of these sanctuaries, was safe from the clan which raised it. But the different tribes seldom respected sanctuaries of other tribes, and the men who had pursued him certainly had no sacred spots of their own in this region. They were the men of the Eagle, whose villages lay far to the east, adjoining the country of the wolf Picts. It was the wolves who had captured him in a foray against the Aquilonian settlements along Thunder River, and they had given him to the Eagles in return for a captured wolf chief. The Eagle men had a red score against the giant Cimmerian, and now it was redder still, for his escape had cost the life of a noted war chief. That was why they had followed him so relentlessly, over broad rivers and hills, and through the long leagues of gloomy forest, the hunting grounds of hostile tribes. And now, the survivors of that long chase turned back when their enemy was run to earth and trapped. He shook his head, unable to understand it. He rose gingerly, dizzy from the long grind, and scarcely able to realize that it was over. His limbs were stiff, his wounds ached. He spat dryly and cursed, rubbing his burning bloodshot eyes with the back of his thick wrist. He blinked and took stock of his surroundings. Below him, the green wilderness waved and billowed away and away in a solid mass. And above its western rim, a steel-blue haze he knew hung over the ocean. The wind stirred his black mane, and the salt tang of the atmosphere revived him. He expanded his enormous chest and drank it in. Then he turned stiffly and painfully about, growling at the twinge in his bleeding calf, and investigated the ledge whereon he stood. Behind it rose a sheer rocky cliff to the crest of the crag, some 30 feet above him. A narrow, ladder-like stair of handholds had been niched into the rock, and a few feet from its foot there was a cleft in the wall, wide enough and tall enough for a man to enter. He limped to the cleft, peered in, and grunted. The sun, hanging high above the western forest, slanted into the cleft, revealing a tunnel-like cavern beyond, and rested a revealing beam on the arch at which this tunnel ended. In that arch was set a heavy, iron-bound oaken door. This was amazing. This country was howling wilderness. The Cimmerian knew that for 1,000 miles this western coast ran bare and uninhabited, except by the villages of the ferocious sea-land tribes, who were even less civilized than their forest-dwelling brothers. The nearest outposts of civilization were the frontier settlements along Thunder River, hundreds of miles to the east. The Cimmerian knew he was the only white man ever to cross the wilderness that lay between that river and the coast. Yet that door was no work of Picts. Being unexplainable, it was an object of suspicion, and suspiciously he approached it, axe and knife ready. Then, as his bloodshot eyes became more accustomed to the soft gloom that lurked on either side of the narrow shaft of sunlight, he noticed something else. Thick, iron-bound chests ranged along the walls. A blaze of comprehension came into his eyes. He bent over one, but the lid resisted his efforts. He lifted his hatchet to shatter the ancient lock, then changed his mind and limped toward the arched door. His bearing was more confident now. His weapons hung at his sides. He pushed against the ornately carven door, and it swung inward without resistance. Then his manner changed again, with lightning-like abruptness. He recoiled with a startled curse, knife and hatchet flashing as they leaped to positions of defense. An instant he poised there, like a statue of fierce menace, craning his massive neck to glare through the door. It was darker in the large natural chamber into which he was looking, but a dim glow emanated from the great jewel, which stood on a tiny ivory pedestal in the center of the great ebony table, about which sat those silent shapes whose appearance had so startled the intruder. They did not move. They did not turn their heads toward him. "Well," he said harshly, "are you all drunk?" There was no reply. He was not a man easily abashed, yet now he felt disconcerted. "You might offer me a glass of that wine you're swigging," he growled, his natural truculence roused by the awkwardness of the situation. "By Crom, you show damned poor courtesy to a man who's been one of your own brotherhood. Are you going to—" His voice trailed into silence, and in silence he stood and stared a while at those bizarre figures sitting so silently about the great ebon table. "They're not drunk," he muttered presently. "They're not even drinking. What devil's game is this?" He stepped across the threshold and was instantly fighting for his life against the murderous, unseen fingers that clutched his throat. Chapter 2: Men from the Sea. Belisa idly stirred a seashell with a daintily slippered toe, mentally comparing its delicate pink edges to the first pink haze of dawn that rose over the misty beaches. It was not dawn now, but the sun was not long up, and the light, pearl-gray clouds which drifted over the waters had not yet been dispelled. Belisa lifted her splendidly shaped head and stared out over a scene alien and repellent to her, yet drearily familiar in every detail. From her dainty feet, the tawny sands ran to meet the softly lapping waves which stretched westward to be lost in the blue haze of the horizon. She was standing on the southern curve of the wide bay, and south of her the land sloped upward to the low ridge which formed one horn of that bay. From that ridge, she knew, one could look southward across the bare waters into infinities of distance, as absolute as the view to the westward and to the northward. Glancing listlessly landward, she absently scanned the fortress which had been her home for the past year. Against a vague pearl and cerulean morning sky floated the golden and scarlet flag of her house, an ensign which awakened no enthusiasm in her youthful bosom, though it had flown triumphantly over many a bloody field in the far south. She made out the figures of men toiling in the gardens and fields that huddled near the fort, seeming to shrink from the gloomy rampart of the forest which fringed the open belt on the east, stretching north and south as far as she could see. She feared that forest, and that fear was shared by everyone in that tiny settlement. Nor was it an idle fear. Death lurked in those whispering depths. Death swift and terrible, death slow and hideous, hidden, painted, tireless, unrelenting. She sighed and moved listlessly toward the water's edge, with no set purpose in mind. The dragging days were all of one color, and the world of cities and courts and gaiety seemed not only thousands of miles, but long ages away. Again, she sought in vain for the reason that had caused a Count of Zingara to flee with his retainers to this wild coast, 1,000 miles from the land that bore him, exchanging the castle of his ancestors for a hut of logs. Her eyes softened at the light patter of small, bare feet across the sands. A young girl came running over the low, sandy ridge, quite naked, her slight body dripping, and her flaxen hair plastered wetly on her small head. Her wistful eyes were wide with excitement. "Lady Belisa," she cried, rendering the Zingaran words with a soft Ophirian accent. "Oh, Lady Belisa." Breathless from her scamper, she stammered and made incoherent gestures with her hands. Belisa smiled and put an arm about the child, not minding that her silken dress came in contact with the damp, warm body. In her lonely, isolated life, Belisa bestowed the tenderness of a naturally affectionate nature on the pitiful waif she had taken away from a brutal master encountered on that long voyage up from the southern coasts. "What are you trying to tell me, Tina? Get your breath, child." "A ship!" cried the girl, pointing southward. "I was swimming in a pool that the sea tide left in the sand on the other side of the ridge, and I saw it, a ship sailing up out of the south." She tugged timidly at Belisa's hand, her slender body all a-quiver, and Belisa felt her own heart beat faster at the mere thought of an unknown visitor. They had seen no sail since coming to that barren shore. Tina flitted ahead of her over the yellow sands, skirting the tiny pools the outgoing tide had left in shallow depressions. They mounted the low, undulating ridge, and Tina poised there, a slender white figure against the clearing sky, her wet flaxen hair blowing about her thin face, a frail, quivering arm outstretched. "Look, my lady?" Belisa had already seen it. A billowing white sail, filled with the freshening south wind, beating up along the coast, a few miles from the point. Her heart skipped a beat. A small thing can loom large in lureless and isolated lives. But Belisa felt a premonition of strange and violent events. She felt that it was not by chance that this sail was beating up this lonely coast. There was no harbor town to the north, though one sailed to the ultimate shores of ice, and the nearest port to the south was 1,000 miles away. What brought this stranger to lonely Corvella Bay? Tina pressed close to her mistress, apprehension pinching her thin features. "Who can it be, my lady?" she stammered, the wind whipping color to her pale cheeks. "Is it the man the Count fears?" Belisa looked down at her, her brows shadowed. "Why do you say that, child? How do you know my uncle fears anyone?" "He must," returned Tina naively, "or he would never have come to hide in this lonely spot. Look, my lady, how fast it comes." "We must go and inform my uncle," murmured Belisa. "The fishing boats have not yet gone out, and none of the men have seen that sail. Get your clothes, Tina. Hurry!" The child scampered down the low slope to the pool where she had been bathing when she sighted the craft, and snatched up the slippers, tunic, and girdle she had left lying on the sand. She skipped back up the ridge, hopping grotesquely as she donned her scanty garments in mid-flight. Belisa, anxiously watching the approaching sail, caught her hand, and they hurried toward the fort. A few moments after they had entered the gate of the log palisade which enclosed the building, the strident blare of the trumpet startled the workers in the gardens, and the men just opening the boathouse doors to push the fishing boats down their rollers to the water's edge. Every man outside the fort dropped his tool or abandoned whatever he was doing and ran for the stockade without pausing to look about for the cause of the alarm. The straggling lines of fleeing men converged on the opened gate, and every head was twisted over its shoulder to gaze fearfully at the dark line of woodland to the east. Not one looked seaward. They thronged through the gate, shouting questions at the sentries who patrolled the firing ledges built below the up-jutting points of the upright palisade logs. "What is it? Why are we called in? Are the Picts coming?" For answer, one taciturn man-at-arms in worn leathers and rusty steel pointed southward. From his vantage point, the sail was now visible. Men began to climb up on the ledges, staring toward the sea. On a small lookout tower on the roof of the manor house, which was built of logs like the other buildings, Count Valenso watched the on-sweeping sail as it rounded the point of the southern horn. The Count was a lean, wiry man of medium height and late middle age. He was dark, somber of expression. Trunk hose and doublet were of black silk. The only color about his costume, the jewels that twinkled on his sword hilt, and the wine-colored cloak thrown carelessly over his shoulder. He twisted his thin black mustache nervously and turned his gloomy eyes on his seneschal, a leather-featured man in steel and satin. "What do you make of it, Galbro?" "A carrack," answered the seneschal. "It is a carrack trimmed and rigged like a craft of the Barashan pirates. Look there." A chorus of cries below them echoed his ejaculation. The ship had cleared the point and was slanting inward across the bay, and all saw the flag that suddenly broke forth from the masthead. A black flag with a scarlet skull gleaming in the sun. The people within the stockade stared wildly at that dread emblem. Then all eyes turned up toward the tower, where the master of the fort stood somberly, his cloak whipping about him in the wind. "It's a Barachan, all right," grunted Galbro, "and unless I am mad, it's Strom's red hand. What is he doing on this naked coast?" "He can mean no good for us," growled the Count. A glance below showed him that the massive gates had been closed, and that the captain of his men-at-arms, gleaming in steel, was directing his men to their stations, some to the ledges, some to the tower loopholes. He was massing his main strength along the western wall, in the midst of which was the gate. Valenso had been followed into exile by 100 men, soldiers, vassals, and serfs. Of these, some 40 were men-at-arms, wearing helmets and suits of mail, armed with swords, axes, and crossbows. The rest were toilers, without armor save for shirts of toughened leather, but they were brawny stalwarts, and skilled in the use of their hunting bows, woodsmen's axes, and boar spears. They took their places, scowling at their hereditary enemies. The pirates of the Barashan Isles, a tiny archipelago off the southwestern coast of Zingara, had preyed on the people of the mainland for more than a century. The men on the stockade gripped their bows or boar spears and stared somberly at the carrack which swung inshore, its brasswork flashing in the sun. They could see the figures swarming on the deck and hear the lusty yells of the seamen. Steel twinkled along the rail. The Count had retired from the tower, shooing his niece and her eager protégé before him, and having donned helmet and cuirass, he betook himself to the palisade to direct the defense. His subjects watched him with moody fatalism. They intended to sell their lives as dearly as they could, but they had scant hope of victory, in spite of their strong position. They were oppressed by a conviction of doom. A year on that naked coast, with the brooding threat of that devil-haunted forest looming forever at their backs, had shadowed their souls with gloomy forebodings. Their women stood silently in the doorways of their huts, built inside the stockade, and quieted the clamor of their children. Belisa and Tina watched eagerly from an upper window in the manor house, and Belisa felt the child's tense little body, all a-quiver within the crook of her protecting arm. "They will cast anchor near the boathouse," murmured Belisa. "Yes, there goes their anchor, 100 yards offshore. Do not tremble so, child. They cannot take the fort. Perhaps they wish only fresh water and supplies. Perhaps a storm blew them into these seas." "They are coming ashore in longboats," exclaimed the child. "Oh, my lady, I am afraid. They are big men in armor. Look how the sun strikes fire from their pikes and burgonets. Will they eat us?" Belisa burst into laughter in spite of her apprehension. "Of course not. Who put that idea into your head?" "Zingalito told me the Baracans eat women." "He was teasing you. The Barashans are cruel, but they are no worse than the Zingaran renegades who call themselves buccaneers. Zingalito was a buccaneer once." "He was cruel," muttered the child. "I'm glad the Picts cut his head off." "Hush, child," Belisa shuddered slightly. "You must not speak that way. Look, the pirates have reached the shore. They line the beach, and one of them is coming toward the fort. That must be Strom." "Ahoy! The fort there!" came a hail in a voice gusty as the wind. "I come under a flag of truce." The Count's helmeted head appeared over the points of the palisade. His stern face, framed in steel, surveyed the pirates somberly. Strom had halted just within good earshot. He was a big man, bareheaded, his tawny hair blowing in the wind. Of all the sea rovers who haunted the Barashans, none was more famed for deviltry than he. "Speak," commanded Valenso. "I have scant desire to converse with one of your breed." Strom laughed with his lips, not with his eyes. "When your galleon escaped me in that squall off the Tralibs last year, I never thought to meet you again on the Pictish coast, Valenso," said he, "although at the time I wondered what your destination might be. By Mitra, had I known, I would have followed you then. I got the start of my life a little while ago when I saw your scarlet falcon floating over a fortress, where I had thought to see naught but bare beach. You have found it, of course. Found what? Snapped the Count impatiently. Don't try to dissemble with me. The pirate's stormy nature showed itself momentarily in a flash of impatience. I know why you came here, and I have come for the same reason. I don't intend to be balked. Where is your ship? That is none of your affair. You have none, confidently asserted the pirate. I see pieces of a galleon's masts in that stockade. It must have been wrecked somehow after you landed here. If you'd had a ship, you'd have sailed away with your plunder long ago. What are you talking about, damn you? Yelled the Count. My plunder? Am I a barracan to burn and loot? Even so, what would I loot on this naked coast? That which you came to find, answered the pirate coolly. The same thing I'm after and mean to have. But I'll be easy to deal with. Just give me the loot, and I'll go my way and leave you in peace. You must be mad, snarled Valenso. I came here to find solitude and seclusion, which I enjoyed until you crawled out of the sea, you yellow-headed dog. Begone, I did not ask for a parley, and I weary of this empty talk. Take your rogues and go your ways. When I go, I'll leave that hovel in ashes, roared the pirate in a transport of rage. For the last time, will you give me the loot in return for your lives? I have you hemmed in here, and 150 men ready to cut your throats at my word. For answer, the Count made a quick gesture with his hand below the points of the palisade. Almost instantly, a shaft hummed venomously through a loophole and splintered on Strom's breastplate. The pirate yelled ferociously, bounded back and ran toward the beach, with arrows whistling all about him. His men roared and came on like a wave, blades gleaming in the sun. "Curse you, dog!" raved the Count, felling the offending archer with his iron-clad fist. "Why did you not strike his throat above the gorget? Ready with your bows, men! Here they come!" But Strom had reached his men, checked their headlong rush. The pirates spread out in a long line that overlapped the extremities of the western wall and advanced warily, loosing their shafts as they came. Their weapon was the longbow, and their archery was superior to that of the Zingarans, but the latter were protected by their barrier. The long arrows arched over the stockade and quivered upright in the earth. One struck the windowsill over which Belisa watched, wringing a cry of fear from Tina, who cringed back, her wide eyes fixed on the venomous, vibrating shaft. The Zingarans sent their bolts and hunting arrows in return, aiming and loosing without undue haste. The women had herded the children into their huts, and now stoically awaited whatever fate the gods had in store for them. The Barashans were famed for their furious and headlong style of battling, but they were wary as they were ferocious, and did not intend to waste their strength vainly in direct charges against the ramparts. They maintained their widespread formation, creeping along and taking advantage of every natural depression and bit of vegetation, which was not much, for the ground had been cleared on all sides of the fort, against the threat of Pictish raids. A few bodies lay prone on the sandy earth, back pieces glinting in the sun, quarrel shafts standing up from armpit or neck. But the pirates were quick as cats, always shifting their position, and were protected by their light armor. Their constant raking fire was a continual menace to the men in the stockade. Still, it was evident that as long as the battle remained an exchange of archery, the advantage must remain with the sheltered Zingarans. But down at the boathouse on the beach, men were at work with axes. The Count cursed sulphurously when he saw the havoc they were making among his boats, which had been built laboriously of planks sawn out of solid logs. "They're making a mantlet, curse them!" he raged. "A sally now before they complete it, while they're scattered!" Galbro shook his head, glancing at the bare-armed henchmen with their clumsy pikes. "Their arrows would riddle us, and we'd be no match for them in hand-to-hand fighting. We must keep behind our walls and trust to our archers." "Well enough," growled Valenso, "if we can keep them outside our walls." Presently the intention of the pirates became apparent to all, as a group of some 30 men advanced, pushing before them a great shield made out of the planks from the boats and the timbers of the boathouse itself. They had found an ox cart and mounted the mantlet on the wheels, great solid discs of oak. As they rolled it ponderously before them, it hid them from the sight of the defenders, except for glimpses of their moving feet. It rolled toward the gate, and the straggling line of archers converged toward it, shooting as they ran. "Shoot!" yelled Valenso, going livid. "Stop them before they reach the gate!" A storm of arrows whistled across the palisade and feathered themselves harmlessly in the thick wood. A derisive yell answered the volley. Shafts were finding loopholes now as the rest of the pirates drew nearer, and a soldier reeled and fell from the ledge, gasping and choking, with a cloth-yard shaft through his throat. "Shoot at their feet!" screamed Valenso, and then, 40 men at the gate with pikes and axes, the rest hold the wall." Bolts ripped into the sand before the moving shield. A bloodthirsty howl announced that one had found its target beneath the edge, and a man staggered into view, cursing and hopping, as he strove to withdraw the quarrel that skewered his foot. In an instant, he was feathered by a dozen hunting arrows. But, with a deep-throated shout, the mantlet was pushed to the wall, and a heavy iron-tipped boom, thrust through an aperture in the center of the shield, began to thunder on the gate, driven by arms knotted with brawny muscles and backed with bloodthirsty fury. The massive gate groaned and staggered, while from the stockade bolts poured in a steady hail, and some struck home. But the wild men of the sea were afire with the fighting lust. With deep shouts they swung the ram, and from all sides the others closed in, braving the weakened fire from the walls, and shooting fast and hard. Cursing like a madman, the Count sprang from the wall and ran to the gate, drawing his sword. A clump of desperate men-at-arms closed in behind him, gripping their spears. In another moment the gate would cave in, and they must stop the gap with their living bodies. Then a new note entered the clamor of the melee. It was a trumpet, blaring stridently from the ship. On the cross trees, a figure waved his arms and gesticulated wildly. That sound registered on Strom's ears, even as he lent his strength to the swinging ram. Exerting his mighty thews, he resisted the surge of the other arms, bracing his legs to halt the ram on its backward swing. He turned his head, sweat dripping from his face. "Wait!" he roared. "Wait, damn you! Listen!" In the silence that followed that bull's bellow, the blare of the trumpet was plainly heard, and a voice that shouted something unintelligible to the people inside the stockade. But Strom understood, for his voice was lifted again in profane command. The ram was released, and the mantlet began to recede from the gate, as swiftly as it had advanced. "Look!" cried Tina at her window, jumping up and down in her wild excitement. "They are running, all of them! They are running to the beach! Look, they have abandoned the shield just out of range! They are leaping into the boats and rowing for the ship! Oh, my lady, have we won?" "I think not." Belisa was staring seaward. "Look!" She threw the curtains aside and leaned from the window. Her clear young voice rose above the amazed shouts of the defenders, turned their heads in the direction she pointed. They sent up a deep yell as they saw another ship swinging majestically around the southern point. Even as they looked, she broke out the royal golden flag of Zingara. Strom's pirates were swarming up the sides of their carrack, heaving up the anchor. Before the stranger had progressed halfway across the bay, the red hand was vanishing around the point of the northern horn. Chapter 3. The Coming of the Black Man. "Out! "Quick!" snapped the Count, tearing at the bars of the gate. "Destroy that mantlet before these strangers can land!" "But Strom has fled," expostulated Galbro, "and yonder ship is Zingaran." "Do as I order!" roared Valenso. "My enemies are not all foreigners. Out, dogs! 30 of you with axes, and make kindling wood of that mantlet. Bring the wheels into the stockade." 30 axemen raced down toward the beach, brawny men in sleeveless tunics, their axes gleaming in the sun. The manner of their lord had suggested a possibility of peril in that oncoming ship, and there was panic in their haste. The splintering of the timbers under their flying axes came plainly to the people inside the fort, and the axemen were racing back across the sands, trundling the great oaken wheels with them, before the Zingaran ship had dropped anchor where the pirate ship had stood. "Why does not the Count open the gate and go down to meet them?" wondered Tina. "Is he afraid that the man he fears might be on that ship?" "What do you mean, Tina?" Belisa demanded uneasily. The Count had never vouchsafed a reason for this self-exile. He was not the sort of a man to run from an enemy, though he had many. But this conviction of Tina's was disquieting, almost uncanny. Tina seemed not to have heard her question. "The axemen are back in the stockade," she said. "The gate is closed again and barred. The men still keep their places along the wall. If that ship was chasing Strom, why did it not pursue him? But it is not a warship. It is a carrack like the other. Look, a boat is coming ashore. I see a man in the bow, wrapped in a dark cloak." The boat having grounded, this man came pacing leisurely up the sands, followed by 3 others. He was a tall, wiry man, clad in black silk and polished steel. "Halt!" roared the Count. "I will parley with your leader alone." The taller stranger removed his morion and made a sweeping bow. His companions halted, drawing their wide cloaks about them, and behind them the sailors leaned on their oars and stared at the flag floating over the palisade. When he came within easy call of the gate, "Why, surely," said he, "there should be no suspicion between gentlemen and these naked seas." Valenso stared at him suspiciously. The stranger was dark, with a lean, predatory face and a thin black mustache. A bunch of lace was gathered at his throat, and there was lace on his wrists. "I know you," said Valenso slowly. "You are Black Zarono, the buccaneer." Again the stranger bowed with stately elegance, and none could fail to recognize the red falcon of the Corzettas. "It seems this coast has become the rendezvous of all the rogues of the southern seas," growled Valenso. "What do you wish?" "Come, come, sir," remonstrated Zarono. "This is a churlish greeting to one who has just rendered you a service. Was not that Argasian dog Strom just thundering at your gate? And did he not take to his sea heels when he saw me round the point?" "True," grunted the Count grudgingly, "though there is little to choose between a pirate and a renegade." Zarono laughed without resentment and twirled his mustache. "You are blunt in speech, my lord, but I desire only leave to anchor in your bay, to let my men hunt for meat and water in your woods, and perhaps to drink a glass of wine myself at your board." "I see not how I can stop you," growled Valenso. "But understand this, Zarono, no man of your crew comes within this palisade. If one approaches closer than 100 feet, he will presently find an arrow through his gizzard. And I charge you do no harm to my gardens or the cattle in the pens. 3 steers you may have for fresh meat, but no more. And we can hold this fort against your ruffians, in case you think otherwise." "Okay. You were not holding it very successfully against Strom," the buccaneer pointed out with a mocking smile. "You'll find no wood to build mantlets unless you chop down trees or strip it from your own ship," assured the Count grimly. "And your men are not Barracan archers. They're no better bowmen than mine. Besides, what little loot you'd find in this castle would not be worth the price." "Who speaks of loot and warfare?" protested Zarono. "Nay, My men are sick to stretch their legs ashore, and nigh to scurvy from chewing salt pork. I guarantee their good conduct. May they come ashore?" Valenso grudgingly signified his consent, and Zarono bowed a bit sardonically, and retired with a tread as measured and stately as if he trod the polished crystal floor of the Cordova royal court, where indeed, unless rumor lied, he had once been a familiar figure. "Let no man leave the stockade," Valenso ordered Galbro. "I do not trust that renegade dog. Because he drove Strom from our gate is no guarantee that he would not cut our throats." Galbro nodded. He was well aware of the enmity which existed between the pirates and the Zingaran buccaneers. The pirates were mainly Argosian sailors, turned outlaw. To the ancient feud between Argos and Zingara was added, in the case of the freebooters, the rivalry of opposing interests. Both breeds preyed on the shipping and the coastal towns, and they preyed on one another with equal rapacity. So no one stirred from the palisade while the buccaneers came ashore, dark-faced men in flaming silk and polished steel, with scarfs bound about their heads and gold hoops in their ears. They camped on the beach, 170-odd of them, and Valenso noticed that Zarono posted lookouts on both points. They did not molest the gardens, and only the 3 beeves designated by Valenso, shouting from the palisade, were driven forth and slaughtered. Fires were kindled on the strand, and a wattled cask of ale was brought ashore and broached. Other kegs were filled with water from the spring that rose a short distance south of the fort, and men began to straggle toward the woods, crossbows in their hands. Seeing this, Valenso was moved to shout to Zarono, striding back and forth through the camp, "Don't let your men go into the forest! Take another steer from the pens if you haven't enough meat! If they go trampling into the woods, they may fall foul of the Picts. Whole tribes of the painted devils live back in the forest. We beat off an attack shortly after we landed, and since then 6 of my men have been murdered in the forest at one time or another. There's peace between us just now, but it hangs by a thread. Don't risk stirring them up." Zarono shot a startled glance at the lowering woods, as if he expected to see hordes of savage figures lurking there. Then he bowed and said, "I thank you for the warning, my lord." And he shouted for his men to come back, in a rasping voice that contrasted strangely with his courtly accents when addressing the Count. If Zarono could have penetrated the leafy mask, he would have been more apprehensive. If he could have seen the sinister figure that lurked there, watching the strangers with inscrutable black eyes. A hideously painted warrior, naked but for a doe-skin breechclout, with a toucan feather drooping over his left ear. As evening drew on, a thin skim of gray crawled up from the sea rim and overcast the sky. The sun sank in a wallow of crimson, touching the tips of the black waves with blood. Fog crawled out of the sea and lapped at the feet of the forest, curling about the stockade in smoky wisps. The fires on the beach shone dull crimson through the mist, and the singing of the buccaneers seemed deadened and far away. They had brought old sail canvas from the carrack and made them shelters along the strand, where beef was still roasting, and the ale granted them by their captain was doled out sparingly. The great gate was shut and barred. Soldiers stolidly tramped the ledges of the palisade, pike on shoulder, beads of moisture glistening on their steel caps. They glanced uneasily at the fires on the beach, stared with greater fixity toward the forest, now a vague dark line in the crawling fog. The compound lay empty of life, a bare, darkened space. Candles gleamed feebly through the crack of the huts, and light streamed from the windows of the manor. There was silence, except for the tread of the sentries, the drip of water from the eaves, and the distant singing of the buccaneers. Some faint echo of this singing penetrated into the great hall, where Valenso sat at wine with his unsolicited guest. "Your men make merry, sir," grunted the count. "They are glad to feel the sand under their feet again," answered Zarono. "It has been a wearisome voyage, yea, a long stern chase." He lifted his goblet gallantly to the unresponsive girl who sat on his host's right and drank ceremoniously. Impassive attendants ranged the walls, soldiers with pikes and helmets, servants in satin coats. Valenso's household in this wild land was a shadowy reflection of the court he had kept in Cordova. The manor house, as he insisted on calling it, was a marvel for that coast. 100 men had worked night and day for months building it. Its log-walled exterior was devoid of ornamentation, but within it was as nearly a copy of Corzetta Castle as was possible. The logs that composed the walls of the hall were hidden with heavy silk tapestries worked in gold. Ship beams, stained and polished, formed the beams of the lofty ceiling. The floor was covered with rich carpets. The broad stair that led up from the hall was likewise carpeted, and its massive balustrade had once been a galleon's rail. A fire in the wide stone fireplace dispelled the dampness of the night. Candles in the great silver candelabrum in the center of the broad mahogany board lit the hall, throwing long shadows on the stair. Count Valenso sat at the head of that table, presiding over a company composed of his niece, his piratical guest, Galbro, and the captain of the guard. The smallness of the company emphasized the proportions of the vast board, where 50 guests might have sat at ease. "You followed Strom?" asked Valenso. "You drove him this far afield?" "I followed Strom," laughed Zarono, "but he was not fleeing from me. Strom is not the man to flee from anyone. No, he came seeking for something I, too, desire." "What could tempt a pirate or a buccaneer to this naked land?" muttered Valenso, staring into the sparkling contents of his goblet. "What could tempt a Count of Cordova?" retorted Zarono, and an avid light burned an instant in his eyes. "The rottenness of a royal court might sicken a man of honor," remarked Valenso. "Corzettas of honor have endured its rottenness with tranquility for several generations," said Zarono bluntly. "My lord, indulge my curiosity. Why did you sell your lands, load your galleon with the furnishings of your castle, and sail over the horizon out of the knowledge of the king and the nobles of Zingara? And why settle here, when your sword and your name might carve out a place for you in any civilized land?" Valenso toyed with the gold seal chain about his neck. "As to why I left Zingara," he said, "that is my own affair. But it was chance that left me stranded here. I had brought all my people ashore, and much of the furnishings you mentioned, intending to build a temporary habitation. But my ship, anchored out there in the bay, was driven against the cliffs of the North Point and wrecked by a sudden storm out of the west. Such storms are common enough at certain times of the year. After that, there was naught to do but remain and make the best of it." "Then you would return to civilization if you could?" "Not to Cordova, but perhaps to some far clime, to Vendia or Kitai." "Do you not find it tedious here, my lady?" asked Zarono, for the first time addressing himself directly to Belisa. Hunger to see a new face and hear a new voice had brought the girl to the great hall that night. But now she wished she had remained in her chamber with Tina. There was no mistaking the meaning in the glance Zarono turned on her. His speech was decorous and formal, his expression sober and respectful, but it was but a mask through which gleamed the violent and sinister spirit of the man. He could not keep the burning desire out of his eyes when he looked at the aristocratic young beauty in her low-necked satin gown and jeweled girdle. "There is little diversity here," she answered in a low voice. "If you had a ship," Zarono bluntly asked his host, "you would abandon this settlement." "Perhaps," admitted the Count. "I have a ship," said Zarono. "If we could reach an agreement." "What sort of an agreement?" Valenso lifted his head to stare suspiciously at his guest. "Share and share alike," said Zarono, laying his hand on the board with the fingers spread wide. The gesture was curiously reminiscent of a great spider, but the fingers quivered with curious tension, and the buccaneer's eyes burned with a new light. "Share what?" Valenso stared at him in evident bewilderment. "The gold I brought with me went down in my ship, and unlike the broken timbers, it did not wash ashore." "Not that," Zarono made an impatient gesture. "Let us be frank, my lord. Can you pretend it was chance which caused you to land at this particular spot, with 1,000 miles of coast from which to choose?" "There is no need for me to pretend," answered Valenso coldly. "My ship's master was one Zingalito, formerly a buccaneer. He had sailed this coast and persuaded me to land here, telling me he had a reason he would later disclose. But this reason he never divulged, because the day after we landed, he disappeared into the woods, and his headless body was found later by a hunting party. Obviously he was ambushed and slain by the Picts." Zarono stared fixedly at Valenso for a space. "Sink me," quoth he at last. "I believe you, my lord. A Corzetta has no skill at lying, regardless of his other accomplishments. And I will make you a proposal. I will admit, when I anchored out there in the bay, I had other plans in mind. Supposing you to have already secured the treasure, I meant to take this fort by strategy and cut all your throats. But circumstances have caused me to change my mind." He cast a glance at Belisa that brought the color into her face and made her lift her head indignantly. "I have a ship to carry you out of exile," said the buccaneer, "with your household and such of your retainers as you shall choose. The rest can fend for themselves." The attendants along the walls shot uneasy glances sidelong at each other. Zarono went on, "Too brutally cynical to conceal his intentions. But first, you must help me secure the treasure for which I've sailed 1,000 miles." "What treasure? In Mitra's name?" demanded the Count angrily. "You are yammering like that dog, Strom, now." "Did you ever hear of bloody Tranicos, the greatest of the Barashan pirates?" asked Zarono. "Who has not? It was he who stormed the island castle of the exiled Prince Tothmekri of Stygia, put the people to the sword, and bore off the treasure the prince had brought with him when he fled from Kemi. Aye, and the tale of that treasure brought the men of the Red Brotherhood swarming like vultures after carrion. Pirates, buccaneers, even the black corsairs from the south. Fearing betrayal by his captains, he fled northward with one ship and vanished from the knowledge of men. That was nearly 100 years ago. But the tale persists that one man survived that last voyage and returned to the Barashans, only to be captured by a Zingaran warship. Before he was hanged, he told his story and drew a map in his own blood, on parchment, which he smuggled somehow out of his captor's reach. This was the tale he told. Tranicos had sailed far beyond the paths of shipping, until he came to a bay on a lonely coast, and there he anchored. He went ashore, taking his treasure, and 11 of his most trusted captains who had accompanied him on his ship. Following his orders, the ship sailed away to return in a week's time and pick up their admiral and his captains. In the meantime, Tranicos meant to hide the treasure somewhere in the vicinity of the bay. The ship returned at the appointed time, but there was no trace of Tranicos and his 11 captains, except the rude dwelling they had built on the beach. This had been demolished, and there were tracks of naked feet about it, but no sign to show there had been any fighting. Nor was there any trace of the treasure or any sign to show where it was hidden. The pirates plunged into the forest to search for their chief and his captains, but were attacked by wild Picts and driven back to their ship. In despair, they heaved anchor and sailed away. But before they raised the barachans, a terrific storm wrecked the ship, and only that one man survived. That is the tale of the treasure of Tranicos, which men have sought in vain for nearly a century. That the map exists is known, but its whereabouts have remained a mystery. I have had one glimpse at that map. Strom and Zingalito were with me, and an Amedian who sailed with the barachans. We looked upon it in a hovel in a certain Zingaran seaport town, where we were skulking in disguise. Somebody knocked over the lamp, and somebody howled in the dark. And when we got the light on again, the old miser who owned the map was dead with a dirk in his heart, and the map was gone, and the night watch was clattering down the street with their pikes to investigate the clamor. We scattered, and each went his own way. For years thereafter, Strom and I watched one another, each supposing the other had the map. Well, as it turned out, neither had it. But recently, word came to me that Strom had departed northward, so I followed him. You saw the end of that chase. I had but a glimpse at the map as it lay on the old miser's table, and could tell nothing about it. But Strom's actions show that he knows this is the bay where Tranicos anchored. I believe that they hid the treasure somewhere in that forest and returning were attacked and slain by the Picts. The Picts did not get the treasure. Men have traded up and down this coast a little, knowing nothing of the treasure, and no gold ornament or rare jewel has ever been seen in the possession of the coastal tribes. This is my proposal. Let us combine our forces. Strom is somewhere within striking distance. He fled because he feared to be pinned between us, but he will return. But allied, we can laugh at him. We can work out from the fort, leaving enough men here to hold it if he attacks. I believe the treasure is hidden nearby. 12 men could not have conveyed it far. We will find it, load it in my ship, and sail for some foreign port where I can cover my past with gold. I am sick of this life. I want to go back to a civilized land and live like a noble, with riches and slaves and a castle, and a wife of noble blood. Well, demanded the Count, slit-eyed with suspicion. Give me your niece for my wife, demanded the buccaneer bluntly. Belisa cried out sharply and started to her feet. Valenso likewise rose, livid, his fingers knotting convulsively about his goblet, as if he contemplated hurling it at his guest. Zarono did not move. He sat still, one arm on the table, and the fingers hooked like talons. His eyes smoldered with passion and a deep menace. "You dare!" ejaculated Valenso. "You seem to forget you have fallen from your high estate, Count Valenso," growled Zarono. "We are not at the court of Uncourt, my lord. On this naked coast, nobility is measured by the power of men and arms, and there I rank you. Strangers tread Corzetta Castle, and the Corzetta fortune is at the bottom of the sea. You will die here, an exile, unless I give you the use of my ship. You will have no cause to regret the union of our houses. With a new name and a new fortune, you will find that Black Zarono can take his place among the aristocrats of the world and make a son-in-law of which not even a Corzetta need be ashamed." "You are mad to think of it!" exclaimed the Count violently. "You, who is that?" A patter of soft, slippered feet distracted his attention. Tina came hurriedly into the hall, hesitated when she saw the Count's eyes fixed angrily on her, curtsied deeply, and sidled around the table to thrust her small hands into Belisa's fingers. She was panting slightly. Her slippers were damp, and her flaxen hair was plastered down on her head. "Tina!" exclaimed Belisa anxiously. Where have you been? I thought you were in your chamber hours ago." "I was," answered the child breathlessly, "but I missed my coral necklace you gave me." She held it up, a trivial trinket but prized beyond all her other possessions, because it had been Belisa's first gift to her. "I was afraid you wouldn't let me go if you knew. A soldier's wife helped me out of the stockade and back again. Please, my lady, don't make me tell who she was, because I promised not to. I found my necklace by the pool where I bathed this morning. Please punish me if I have done wrong." "Tina," groaned Belisa, clasping the child to her, "I'm not going to punish you, but you should not have gone outside the palisade with these buccaneers camped on the beach and always a chance of Picts skulking about. Let me take you to your chamber and change these damp clothes." "Yes, my lady," murmured Tina, "but first, let me tell you about the black man." "What?" The startling interruption was a cry that burst from Valenso's lips. His goblet clattered to the floor as he caught the table with both hands. If a thunderbolt had struck him, the lord of the castle's bearing could not have been more subtly or horrifyingly altered. His face was livid, his eyes almost starting from his head. "What did you say?" he panted, glaring wildly at the child, who shrank back against Belisa in bewilderment. "What did you say, wench?" "A black man, my lord," she stammered, while Belisa, Zarono, and the attendants stared at him in amazement. "When I went down to the pool to get my necklace, I saw him. There was a strange moaning in the wind, and the sea whimpered like a thing in fear. And then he came. I was afraid and hid behind a little ridge of sand. He came from the sea in a strange black boat, with blue fire playing all about it, but there was no torch. He drew his boat up on the sands below the south point and strode toward the forest, looking like a giant in the fog. A great tall man, black like a Cushite. Valenso reeled as if he had received a mortal blow. He clutched at his throat, snapping the golden chain in his violence. With the face of a madman, he lurched about the table and tore the child screaming from Belisa's arms. "You little slut," he panted. "You lie. You have heard me mumbling in my sleep and have told this lie to torment me. Say you lie before I tear the skin from your back." "Uncle!" cried Belisa in outraged bewilderment, trying to free Tina from his grasp. "Are you mad? What are you about?" With a snarl, he tore her hand from his arm and spun her staggering into the arms of Galbro, who received her with a leer he made little effort to disguise. "Mercy, my lord," sobbed Tina. "I did not lie." "I said you lied," roared Valenso. "Gabrello!" The stolid serving man seized the trembling youngster and stripped her with one brutal wrench that tore her scanty garments from her body. Wheeling, he drew her slender arms over his shoulders, lifting her writhing feet clear of the floor. "Uncle!" shrieked Belisa, writhing vainly in Galbro's lustful grasp. "You are mad! You cannot! Oh, you cannot!" The voice choked in her throat as Valenso caught up a jewel-hilted riding whip and brought it down across the child's frail body with a savage force that left a red wheal across her naked shoulders. Belisa moaned, sick with the anguish in Tina's shriek. The world had suddenly gone mad. As in a nightmare, she saw the stolid faces of the soldiers and servants, beast faces, the faces of oxen, reflecting neither pity nor sympathy. Zarono's faintly sneering face was part of the nightmare. Nothing in that crimson haze was real, except Tina's naked white body, crisscrossed with red welts from shoulders to knees. No sound real except the child's sharp cries of agony and the panting gasps of Valenso as he lashed away with the staring eyes of a madman, shrieking, "You lie! You lie! Curse you! You lie! Admit your guilt, or I will flay your stubborn body! He could not have followed me here. "Oh, have mercy, my lord!" screamed the child, writhing vainly on the brawny servant's back, too frantic with fear and pain to have the wit to save herself by a lie. "I saw him. I do not lie. Mercy, please. Ah!" You fool, screamed Belisa, almost beside herself. "Do you not see she is telling the truth?" "Oh, you beast! Suddenly some shred of sanity seemed to return to the brain of Count Valenso Corzetta. Dropping the whip, he reeled back and fell up against the table, clutching blindly at its edge. He shook as with an ague. His hair was plastered across his brow in dank strands, and sweat dripped from his livid countenance, which was like a carved mask of fear. Tina, released by Gebralo, slipped to the floor in a whimpering heap. Belisa tore free from Galbro, rushed to her, sobbing, and fell on her knees, gathering the pitiful waif into her arms. She lifted a terrible face to her uncle to pour upon him the full vials of her wrath. But he was not looking at her. He seemed to have forgotten both her and his victim. In a daze of incredulity, she heard him say to the buccaneer, "I accept your offer, Zarono. In Mitra's name, let us find this accursed treasure and be gone from this damned coast." At this, the fire of her fury sank to sick ashes. In stunned silence, she lifted the sobbing child in her arms and carried her up the stair. A glance backward showed Valenso crouching rather than sitting at the table, gulping wine from a huge goblet he gripped in both shaking hands, while Zarono towered over him like a somber predatory bird, puzzled at the turn of events, but quick to take advantage of the shocking change that had come over the Count. He was talking in a low, decisive voice, and Valenso nodded mute agreement, like one who scarcely heeds what is being said. Galbro stood back in the shadows, chin pinched between forefinger and thumb, and the attendants along the walls glanced furtively at each other, bewildered by their lord's collapse. Up in her chamber, Belisa laid the half-fainting girl on the bed and set herself to wash and apply soothing ointments to the weals and cuts on her tender skin. Tina gave herself up in complete submission into her mistress's hands, moaning faintly. Belisa felt as if her world had fallen about her ears. She was sick and bewildered, overwrought, her nerves quivering from the brutal shock of what she had witnessed. Fear of and hatred for her uncle grew in her soul. She had never loved him. He was harsh and apparently without natural affection, grasping and avid. But she had considered him just and fearless. Revulsion shook her at the memory of his staring eyes and bloodless face. It was some terrible fear which had roused this frenzy, and because of this fear, Valenso had brutalized the only creature she had to love and cherish. Because of that fear, he was selling her, his niece, to an infamous outlaw. What was behind this madness? Who was the black man Tina had seen? The child muttered in semi-delirium, "I did not lie, my lady. Indeed, I did not. It was a black man in a black boat that burned like blue fire on the water. A tall man, black-skinned, and wrapped in a black cloak. I was afraid when I saw him, and my blood ran cold. He left his boat on the sands and went into the forest. Why did the Count whip me for seeing him?" "Hush, Tina," soothed Belisa. "Lie quiet. The smarting will soon pass." The door opened behind her, and she whirled, snatching up a jeweled dagger. The Count stood in the door, and her flesh crawled at the sight. He looked years older. His face was gray and drawn, and his eyes stared in a way that roused fear in her bosom. She had never been close to him. Now she felt as though a gulf separated them. He was not her uncle who stood there, but a stranger come to menace her. She lifted the dagger. "If you touch her again," she whispered from dry lips, "I swear before Mitra I will sink this blade in your breast." He did not heed her. "I have posted a strong guard about the manor," he said. "Zarono brings his men into the stockade tomorrow. He will not sail until he has found the treasure. When he finds it, we shall sail at once for some port not yet decided upon." "And you will sell me to him?" she whispered. "In Mitra's name." He fixed upon her a gloomy gaze in which all considerations but his own self-interest had been crowded out. She shrank before it, seeing in it the frantic cruelty that possessed the man in his mysterious fear. "You will do as I command," he said presently, with no more human feeling in his voice than there is in the ring of flint on steel. And turning, he left the chamber. Blinded by a sudden rush of horror, Belisa fell fainting beside the couch where Tina lay. Chapter 4. A pirate returns to the sea, droning. Belisa never knew how long she lay crushed and senseless. She was first aware of Tina's arms about her and the sobbing of the child in her ear. Mechanically she straightened herself and drew the girl into her arms. And she sat there, dry-eyed, staring unseeingly at the flickering candle. There was no sound in the castle. The singing of the buccaneers on the strand had ceased. Dully, almost impersonally, she reviewed her problem. Valenso was mad, driven frantic by the story of the mysterious black man. It was to escape this stranger that he wished to abandon the settlement and flee with Zarono. That much was obvious. Equally obvious was the fact that he was ready to sacrifice her in exchange for that opportunity to escape. In the blackness of spirit which surrounded her, she saw no glint of light. The serving men were dull or callous brutes, their women stupid and apathetic. They would neither dare nor care to help her. She was utterly helpless. Tina lifted her tear-stained face, as if she were listening to the prompting of some inner voice. The child's understanding of Belisa's inmost thoughts was almost uncanny, as was her recognition of the inexorable drive of fate and the only alternative left to the weak. "We must go, my lady," she whispered. "Zarono shall not have you. Let us go far away into the forest. We shall go until we can go no further, and then we shall lie down and die together." The tragic strength that is the last refuge of the weak entered Belisa's soul. It was the only escape from the shadows that had been closing in upon her since that day when they fled from Zingara. "We shall go, child." She rose and was fumbling for a cloak when an exclamation from Tina brought her about. The girl was on her feet, a finger pressed to her lips, her eyes wide and bright with terror. "What is it, Tina?" The child's expression of fright induced Belisa to pitch her voice to a whisper, and a nameless apprehension crawled over her. "Someone outside in the hall," whispered Tina, clutching her arm convulsively. "He stopped at our door and then went on toward the Count's chamber at the other end." "Your ears are keener than mine," murmured Belisa. "But there is nothing strange in that. It was the Count himself, perchance, or Galbro." She moved to open the door, but Tina threw her arms frantically about her neck, and Belisa felt the wild beating of her heart. "No, no, my lady. Do not open the door. I am afraid. I do not know why, but I feel that some evil thing is skulking near us." Impressed, Belisa patted her reassuringly and reached a hand toward the gold disc that masked the tiny peephole in the center of the door. "He is coming back," shivered the girl. "I hear him." Belisa Media heard something too, a curious, stealthy pad which she knew, with a chill of nameless fear, was not the step of anyone she knew, nor was it the step of Zarono, or any booted man. Could it be the buccaneer gliding along the hallway on bare, stealthy feet to slay his host while he slept? She remembered the soldiers who would be on guard below. If the buccaneer had remained in the manor for the night, a man-at-arms would be posted before his chamber door. But who was that sneaking along the corridor? None slept upstairs besides herself, Tina, and the Count, except Galbro. With a quick motion, she extinguished the candle so it would not shine through the hole in the door, and pushed aside the gold disc. All the lights were out in the hall, which was ordinarily lighted by candles. Someone was moving along the darkened corridor. She sensed rather than saw a dim bulk moving past her doorway, but she could make nothing of its shape, except that it was man-like. But a chill wave of terror swept over her, so she crouched dumb, incapable of the scream that froze behind her lips. It was not such terror as her uncle now inspired in her, or fear like her fear of Zarono, or even of the brooding forest. It was blind, unreasoning terror that laid an icy hand on her soul and froze her tongue to her palate. The figure passed on to the stairhead, where it was limned momentarily against the faint glow that came up from below. And at the glimpse of that vague black image against the red, she almost fainted. She crouched there in the darkness, awaiting the outcry that would announce that the soldiers in the great hall had seen the intruder. But the manor remained silent. Somewhere a wind wailed shrilly. That was all. Belisa's hands were moist with perspiration as she groped to relight the candle. She was still shaken with horror, though she could not decide just what there had been about that black figure etched against the red glow that had roused this frantic loathing in her soul. It was man-like in shape, but the outline was strangely alien, abnormal, though she could not clearly define that abnormality. But she knew that it was no human being that she had seen, and she knew that the sight had robbed her of all her newfound resolution. She was demoralized, incapable of action. The candle flared up, limning Tina's white face in the yellow glow. "It was the black man," whispered Tina. "I know. My blood turned cold, just as it did when I saw him on the beach. There are soldiers downstairs. Why did they not see him? Shall we go and inform the Count?" Belisa shook her head. She did not care to repeat the scene that had ensued upon Tina's first mention of the black man. At any event, she dared not venture out into that darkened hallway. "We dare not go into the forest," shuddered Tina. "He will be lurking there." Belisa did not ask the girl how she knew the black man would be in the forest. It was the logical hiding place for any evil thing, man or devil, and she knew Tina was right. They dared not leave the fort now. Her determination, which had not faltered at the prospect of certain death, gave way at the thought of traversing those gloomy woods with that black, shambling creature at large among them. Helplessly, she sat down and sank her face in her hands. Tina slept presently on the couch, whimpering occasionally in her sleep. Tears sparkled on her long lashes. She moved her smarting body uneasily in her restless slumber. Toward dawn, Belisa was aware of a stifling quality in the atmosphere. She heard a low rumble of thunder somewhere off to seaward. Extinguishing the candle which had burned to its socket, she went to a window whence she could see both the ocean and a belt of the forest behind the fort. The fog had disappeared, but out to sea a dusky mass was rising from the horizon. From it lightning flickered, and the low thunder growled. An answering rumble came from the black woods. Startled, she turned and stared at the forest, a brooding black rampart. A strange rhythmic pulsing came to her ears, a droning reverberation that was not the roll of a Pictish drum. "The drum!" sobbed Tina, spasmodically opening and closing her fingers in her sleep. "The black man beating on a black drum in the black woods! Oh, save us!" Belisa shuddered. Along the eastern horizon ran a thin, white line that presaged dawn. But that black cloud on the western rim writhed and billowed, swelling and expanding. She stared in amazement, for storms were practically unknown on that coast at that time of the year, and she had never seen a cloud like that one. It came pouring up over the world rim in great boiling masses of blackness, veined with fire. It rolled and billowed with the wind in its belly. Its thundering made the air vibrate, and another sound mingled awesomely with the reverberations of the thunder, the voice of the wind that raced before its coming. The inky horizon was torn and convulsed in the lightning flashes. Afar to sea, she saw the white-capped waves racing before the wind. She heard its droning roar, increasing in volume as it swept shoreward. But as yet no wind stirred on the land. The air was hot, breathless. There was a sensation of unreality about the contrast. Out there, wind and thunder and chaos sweeping inland, but here, stifling stillness. Somewhere below her, a shutter slammed, startling in the tense silence, and a woman's voice was lifted, shrill with alarm. But most of the people of the fort seemed sleeping, unaware of the oncoming hurricane. She realized that she still heard that mysterious, droning drumbeat, and she stared toward the black forest, her flesh crawling. She could see nothing, but some obscure instinct or intuition prompted her to visualize a black, hideous figure squatting under black branches and enacting a nameless incantation on something that sounded like a drum. Desperately, she shook off the ghoulish conviction and looked seaward, as a blaze of lightning fairly split the sky. Outlined against its glare, she saw the masts of Zarono's ship. She saw the tents of the buccaneers on the beach, the sandy ridges of the south point, and the rock cliffs of the north point as plainly as by midday sun. Louder and louder rose the roar of the wind, and now the manor was awake. Feet came pounding up the stair, and Zarono's voice yelled, edged with fright. Doors slammed, and Valenso answered him, shouting to be heard above the roar of the elements. "Why didn't you warn me of a storm from the west?" howled the buccaneer. "If the anchors don't hold—" "A storm never came from the west before, at this time of year," shrieked Valenso, rushing from his chamber in his nightshirt, his face livid and his hair standing stiffly on end. "This is the work of—" His words were drowned as he raced madly up the ladder that led to the lookout tower, followed by the swearing buccaneer. Belisa crouched at her window, awed and deafened. Louder and louder rose the wind, until it drowned all other sound. All except that maddening droning that now rose like an inhuman chant of triumph. It roared inshore, driving before it a foaming league-long crest of white. And then all hell and destruction was loosed on that coast. Rain fell in driving torrents, sweeping the beaches with blind frenzy. The wind hit like a thunderclap, making the timbers of the fort quiver. The surf roared over the sands, drowning the coals of the fires the seamen had built. In the glare of lightning, Belisa saw through the curtain of the slashing rain the tents of the buccaneers whipped to ribbons and washed away. Saw the men themselves staggering toward the fort, beaten almost to the sands by the fury of torrent and blast, and limed against the blue glare. She saw Zarono's ship ripped loose from her moorings, driven headlong against the jagged cliffs that jutted up to receive her. Chapter 5. A Man from the Wilderness. The storm had spent its fury. Full dawn rose in a clear blue, rain-washed sky. As the sun rose in a blaze of fresh gold, Bright-hued birds lifted a swelling chorus from the trees, on whose broad leaves beads of water sparkled like diamonds, quivering in the gentle morning breeze. At a small stream which wound over the sands to join the sea, hidden beyond a fringe of trees and bushes, a man bent to lave his hands and face. He performed his ablutions after the manner of his race, grunting lustily and splashing like a buffalo. But in the midst of these splashing, he lifted his head suddenly, his tawny hair dripping and water running in rivulets over his brawny shoulders. He crouched in a listening attitude for a split second, then was on his feet and facing inland, sword in hand, all in one motion, and there he froze, glaring wide-mouthed. A man as big as himself was striding toward him over the sands, making no attempt at stealth. And the pirate's eyes widened as he stared at the close-fitting silk breeches, high-flaring top boots, wide-skirted coat, and headgear of 100 years ago. There was a broad cutlass in the stranger's hand, and unmistakable purpose in his approach. The pirate went pale, as recognition blazed in his eyes. "You!" he ejaculated unbelievingly. "By Mitra, you!" Oaths streamed from his lips as he heaved up his cutlass. The birds rose in flaming showers from the trees as the clang of steel interrupted their song. Blue sparks flew from the hacking blades, and the sand grated and ground under the stamping boot heels. Then the clash of steel ended in a chopping crunch, and one man went to his knees with a choking gasp. The hilt escaped his nerveless hand, and he slid full length on the sand, which reddened with his blood. With a dying effort, he fumbled at his girdle and drew something from it, tried to lift it to his mouth, and then stiffened convulsively and went limp. The conqueror bent and ruthlessly tore the stiffening fingers from the object they crumpled in their desperate grasp. Zarono and Valenso stood on the beach, staring at the driftwood their men were gathering. Spars, pieces of masts, broken timbers. So savagely had the storm hammered Zarono's ship against the low cliffs that most of the salvage was matchwood. Short distance behind them stood Belisa, listening to their conversation, one arm about Tina. The girl was pale and listless, apathetic to whatever fate held in store for her. She heard what the men said, but with little interest. She was crushed by the realization that she was but a pawn in the game. However it was to be played out, whether it was to be a wretched life dragged out on that desolate coast, or a return effected somehow to some civilized land. Zarono cursed venomously, but Valenso seemed dazed. "This is not the time of year for storms from the west," he muttered, staring with haggard eyes at the men dragging the wreckage up on the beach. "It was not chance that brought that storm out of the deep to splinter the ship in which I meant to escape. Escape? I am caught like a rat in a trap as it was meant. Nay, we are all trapped rats." "What nonsense are you talking about, you Zingaran dog, still yammering about that black man of yours?" Valenso shrieked. "He had no business here, with no word of warning. What does this stranger want of me?" The Cimmerian approached at his leisurely wolf's lope and stood regarding the excited group, legs wide-braced, his great sword dangling from his hand. A lock of his square-cut black mane had fallen across his low, broad forehead, and his blue eyes, narrowed and burning, roved over them with a glint of hard, unfamiliar mirth. His costume would have seemed grotesque anywhere but on the Pictish coast. A plumed hat of a forgotten style, a wide-skirted sky-blue coat of faded silk, worn open to reveal a sleeveless shirt of white silk, and close-fitting breeches of the same material, tucked into high, soft leather boots that would have graced a cavalier of the 16th century. At his hip swung a broad, gold-buckled leather belt, in which were thrust a brace of heavy pistols, and from which hung a straight broadsword in a battered leather scabbard. His bare, brawny arms were splashed with caked blood. On the tawny skin of his breast was a curious mark, like an old scar, which somewhat resembled a scarlet falcon with spread wings. Strom and Zarono wheeled to face him, their hands instinctively seeking their sword hilts, their attitudes ferocious. A growl rumbled in their throats. "Keep your shirts on," said Conan coolly. "The war is over." "It hasn't begun yet," snapped Zarono. "What devil's trickery are you up to now?" "Who are you?" demanded Strom. "The man with whom you're going to make a bargain for a share of the treasure of bloody Tranicos, and for your dirty lives." Chapter 6. Men of the Woods. Night had fallen, but torches streamed across the strand, casting the mad scene into lurid revealment. Naked men in paint swarmed the beach. Like waves, they came against the palisade, bared teeth and blazing eyes gleaming in the glare of the torches thrust over the wall. Toucan feathers waved in black manes, and the feathers of the cormorant and the sea falcon. A few warriors, the wildest and most barbaric of them all, wore shark's teeth woven in their tangled locks. The sealand tribes had gathered from up and down the coast and all directions to rid their country of the white-skinned invaders. They surged against the palisade, driving a storm of arrows before them, fighting into the teeth of the shafts and bolts that tore into their mast from the stockade. Sometimes they came so close to the wall, they were hewing at the gate with their war axes and thrusting their spears through the loopholes. But each time, the tide ebbed back without flowing over the palisade, leaving its drift of dead. At this kind of fighting, the freebooters of the sea were at their stoutest. Their arrows and bolts tore holes in the charging horde. Their cutlasses hewed the wild men from the palisade they strove to scale. Yet again and again, the men of the woods returned to the onslaught with all the stubborn ferocity that had been roused in their fierce hearts. "They are like mad dogs," gasped Zarono, hacking downward at the dark hands that grasped at the palisade points, the dark faces that snarled up at him. "If we can hold the fort until dawn, they'll lose heart," grunted Conan, splitting a feathered skull with professional precision. "They won't maintain a long siege. Look, they're falling back." The charge rolled back, and the men on the wall shook the sweat out of their eyes, counted their dead, and took a fresh grasp on the blood-slippery hilts of their swords. Like blood-hungry wolves, grudgingly driven from a cornered prey, the Picts skulked back beyond the ring of torches. Only the bodies of the slain lay before the palisade. "Have they gone?" Strom shook back his wet, tawny locks. The cutlass in his fist was notched and red. His brawny, bare arm was splashed with blood. "They're still out there." Conan nodded toward the outer darkness, which ringed the circle of torches, made more intense by their light. He glimpsed movements in the shadows, glint of eyes, and the dull sheen of steel. "They've drawn off for a bit, though," he said. "Post sentries on the wall, and let the rest drink and eat. It's past midnight. We've been fighting for hours without much interval." The chiefs clambered down from the ledges, calling their men from the walls. A sentry was posted in the middle of each wall, east, west, north, and south, and a clump of men-at-arms were left at the gate. The Picts, to reach the wall, would have to charge across a wide, torch-lit space, and the defenders could resume their places long before the attackers could reach the palisade. "Where's Valenso?" demanded Conan, gnawing a huge beef bone as he stood beside the fire the men had built in the center of the compound. Pirates, buccaneers, and henchmen mingled with each other, wolfing the meat and ale the women brought them, and allowing their wounds to be bandaged. "He disappeared an hour ago," grunted Strom. He was fighting on the wall beside me, when suddenly he stopped short and glared out into the darkness, as if he saw a ghost. "Look," he croaked, "the black devil, I see him out there in the night." Well, I could swear I saw a figure moving among the shadows that was too tall for a Pict, but it was just a glimpse, and it was gone. But Valenso jumped down from the firing ledge and staggered into the manor like a man with a mortal wound. I haven't seen him since. "He probably saw a forest devil," said Conan tranquilly. "The Picts say this coast is lousy with them. What I'm more afraid of is fire arrows. The Picts are likely to start shooting them at any time." "What's that? It sounded like a cry for help." When the lull came in the fighting, Belisa and Tina had crept to their window, from which they had been driven by the danger of flying arrows. Silently, they watched the men gather about the fire. "There are not enough men on the stockade," said Tina. In spite of her nausea at the sight of the corpses sprawled about the palisade, Belisa was forced to laugh. "Do you think you know more about wars and sieges than the freebooters?" she chided gently. "There should be more men on the walls," insisted the child, shivering. "Suppose the black man came back." Belisa shuddered at the thought. "I am afraid," murmured Tina. "I wish Strom and Zarono are killed." "And not Conan?" asked Belisa curiously. "Conan would not harm us," said the child confidently. "He lives up to his barbaric code of honor, but they are men who have lost all honor." "You are wise beyond your years, Tina," said Belisa, with the vague uneasiness the precocity of the girl frequently roused in her. "Look!" Tina stiffened. "The sentry is gone from the south wall. I saw him on the ledge a moment ago. Now he has vanished." From their window, the palisade points of the south wall were just visible over the slanting roofs of a row of huts, which paralleled that wall almost its entire length. A sort of open-topped corridor, 3 or 4 yards wide, was framed by the stockade and the back of the huts, which were built in a solid row. These huts were occupied by the serfs. "Where could the sentry have gone?" whispered Tina uneasily. Belisa was watching one end of the hut row, which was not far from a side door of the manor. She could have sworn she saw a shadowy figure glide from behind the huts and disappear at the door. Was that the vanished sentry? Why had he left the wall? And why should he steal so subtly into the manor? She did not believe it was the sentry she had seen, and a nameless fear congealed her blood. "Where is the Count, Tina?" she asked. "In the great hall, my lady. He sits alone at the table, wrapped in his cloak and drinking wine, with a face gray as death." "Go and tell him what we have seen. I will keep watch from this window, lest the Picts steal to the unguarded wall." Tina scampered away. Belisa heard her slippered feet pattering along the corridor, receding down the stair. Then abruptly, terribly, there rang out a scream of such poignant fear that Belisa's heart almost stopped with the shock of it. She was out of the chamber and flying down the corridor before she was aware that her limbs were in motion. She ran down the stair and halted as if turned to stone. She did not scream, as Tina had screamed. She was incapable of sound or motion. She saw Tina. She was aware of the reality of small hands grasping her frantically. But these were the only sane realities in a scene of black nightmare and lunacy and death, dominated by the monstrous, anthropomorphic shadow which spread awful arms against a lurid hellfire glare. Out in the stockade, Strom shook his head at Conan's question. "I heard nothing." "I did!" Conan's wild instincts were roused. He was tensed, his eyes blazing. "It came from the south wall behind those huts." Drawing his cutlass, he strode toward the palisade. From the compound, the wall on the south and the sentry posted there were not visible. being hidden behind the huts. Strom followed, impressed by the Cimmerian's manner. At the mouth of the open space between the huts and wall, Conan halted warily. The space was dimly lighted by torches flaring at either corner of the stockade, and about midway of that natural corridor, a crumpled shape sprawled on the ground. "Brackus!" swore Strom, running forward and dropping on one knee beside the figure. "By Mitra! His throat's been cut from ear to ear!" Conan swept the space with a quick glance, finding it empty save for himself, Strom, and the dead man. He peered through a loophole. No living man moved within the ring of torchlight outside the fort. Who could have done this? He wondered. Zarono. Strom sprang up, spitting fury like a wildcat, his hair bristling, his face convulsed. "He has set his thieves to stabbing my men in the back. He plans to wipe me out by treachery. Devils, I am plagued within and without." "Wait," Conan reached a restraining hand. "I don't believe Zarono," but the maddened pirate jerked away and rushed around the end of the hut row, breathing blasphemies. Conan ran after him, swearing. Strom made straight toward the fire by which Zarono's tall, lean form was visible, as the buccaneer chief quaffed a jack of ale. His amazement was supreme when the jack was dashed violently from his hand, spattering his breastplate with foam, and he was jerked around to confront the passion-distorted face of the pirate captain. "You murdering dog!" roared Strom. "Will you slay my men behind my back while they fight for your filthy hide as well as for mine?" Conan was hurrying toward them, and on all sides men ceased eating and drinking to stare in amazement. "What do you mean?" sputtered Zarono. "You've set your men to stabbing mine at their posts," screamed the maddened Barashan. "You lie!" Smoldering hate burst into sudden flame. With an incoherent howl, Strom heaved up his cutlass and cut at the buccaneer's head. Zarono caught the blow on his armored left arm, and sparks flew as he staggered back, ripping out his own sword. In an instant, the captains were fighting like madmen, their blades flaming and flashing in the firelight. Their crews reacted instantly and blindly. A deep roar went up as pirates and buccaneers drew their swords and fell upon each other. The men left on the wall abandoned their posts and leaped down into the stockade, blades in hand. In an instant, the compound was a battleground, where nodding, writhing groups of men smote and slew in a blind frenzy. Some of the men-at-arms and serfs were drawn into the melee, and the soldiers at the gate turned and stared down in amazement, forgetting the enemy which lurked outside. It had all happened so quickly, smoldering passions exploding into sudden battle, that men were fighting all over the compound before Conan could reach the maddened chiefs. Ignoring their swords, he tore them apart with such violence that they staggered backward, and Zarono tripped and fell headlong. "You cursed fools!" he roared. "Will you throw away all our lives?" Strom was frothing mad, and Zarono was bawling for assistance. A buccaneer ran at Conan from behind and cut at his head. The Cimmerian half turned and caught his arm, checking the stroke in midair. "Look, you fools!" he roared, pointing with his sword. Something in his tone caught the attention of the battle-crazed mob. Men froze in their places with lifted swords, Zarono on one knee, and twisted their heads to stare. Conan was pointing at a soldier on the firing ledge. The man was reeling, arms clawing the air, choking as he tried to shout. Suddenly he pitched headlong to the ground, and all saw the black arrow standing up between his shoulders. A cry of alarm rose from the compound. On the heels of the shout came a clamor of blood-freezing screams, the shattering impact of axes on the gate. Flaming arrows arched over the wall and stuck in logs, and thin wisps of blue smoke curled upward. Then from behind the huts that ranged the south wall came swift and furtive figures racing across the compound. "The Picts are in!" roared Conan. Bedlam followed his shout. The freebooters ceased their feud. Some turned to meet the savages, some to spring to the wall. Savages were pouring from behind the huts, and they streamed over the compound. Their axes flashed against the cutlasses of the sailors. Zarono was struggling to his feet when a painted savage rushed upon him from behind and brained him with a war axe. Conan, with a clump of sailors behind him, was battling with the Picts inside the stockade, and Strom, with most of his men, was climbing up on the firing ledges, slashing at the dark figures already swarming over the wall. The Picts, who had crept up unobserved and surrounded the fort, while the defenders were fighting among themselves, were attacking from all sides. Valenso's soldiers were clustered at the gate, trying to hold it against a howling swarm of exultant demons. More and more savages streamed from behind the huts, having scaled the undefended south wall. Strom and his pirates were beaten back from the other sides of the palisade, and in an instant the compound was swarming with naked warriors. They dragged down the defenders like wolves. The battle revolved into swirling whirlpools of painted figures surging about small groups of desperate white men. Picts, sailors, and henchmen littered the earth, stamped underfoot by the heedless feet. Blood-smeared braves dived howling into huts, and the shrieks that rose from the interiors, where women and children died beneath the red axes, rose above the din of the battle. The men-at-arms abandoned the gate when they heard those pitiful cries, and in an instant the Picts had burst it and were pouring into the palisade at that point also, howling like a myriad of fiends. Huts began to go up in flames. "Make for the manor!" roared Conan, and a dozen men surged in behind him as he hewed an inexorable way through the snarling pack. Strom was at his side, wielding his red cutlass like a flail. "We can't hold the manor," panted the pirate. "Why not?" Conan was too busy with his crimson work to spare a glance. "Because, A knife in a dark hand sank deep in the Barachan's back. "Devil eat you, bastard!" Strom turned staggeringly and split the savage's head to his teeth. The pirate reeled and fell to his knees, blood starting from his lips. "The manor's burning," he croaked, and slumped over in the dust. Conan cast a swift look about him. The men who had followed him were all down in their blood. The Pict, gasping out his life under the Cimmerian's feet, was the last of the group which had barred his way. All about him, battle was swirling and surging. But for the moment, he stood alone. He was not far from the south wall. A few strides, and he could leap to the ledge, swing over, and be gone through the night. But he remembered the helpless girls in the manor, from which now smoke was rolling in billowing masses. He ran toward the manor. A feathered chief wheeled from the door, lifting a war axe, and behind the racing Cimmerian lines of fleet-footed braves were converging upon him. He did not check his stride. His downward sweeping cutlass met and deflected the axe and split the skull of its wielder. An instant later, Conan was through the door and had slammed and bolted it against the axes that splintered into the wood. The great hall was full of drifting wisps of smoke, through which he groped, half-blinded. Somewhere a woman was whimpering, little catchy, hysterical sobs of nerve-shattering horror. He emerged from a whirl of smoke and stopped dead in his tracks, glaring down the hall. The hall was dim and shadowy with drifting smoke. The silver candelabrum was overturned, the candles extinguished. The only illumination was a lurid glow from the great fireplace, and the wall in which it was set, where the flames licked from burning floor to smoking roof beams. And limned against that lurid glare, Conan saw a human form swinging slowly at the end of a rope. The dead face turned toward him as the body swung, and it was distorted beyond recognition. But Conan knew it was Count Valenso, hanged to his own roof beam. But there was something else in the hall. Conan saw it through the drifting smoke, a monstrous black figure outlined against the hellfire glare. That outline was vaguely human, but the shadow thrown on the burning wall was not human at all. "Crom!" muttered Conan, aghast, paralyzed by the realization that he was confronted with a being against which his sword was helpless. He saw Belisa and Tina, clutched in each other's arms, crouching at the bottom of the stair. The black monster reared up, looming gigantic against the flame, great arms spread wide. A dim face leered through the drifting smoke, semi-human, demonic, altogether terrible. Conan glimpsed the close-set horns, the gaping mouth, the peaked ears. It was lumbering toward him through the smoke, and an old memory woke with desperation. Near the Cimmerian stood a massive silver bench, ornately carven, once part of the splendor of Corzetta Castle. Conan grasped it, heaved it high above his head. "Silver and fire!" He roared in a voice like a clap of wind and hurled the bench with all the power of his iron muscles. Full on the great black breast it crashed, 100 pounds of silver winged with terrific velocity. Not even the Black One could stand before such a missile. He was carried off his feet, hurled backward headlong into the open fireplace, which was a roaring mouth of flame. A horrible scream shook the hall, the cry of an unearthly thing gripped suddenly by earthly death. The mantel cracked, and stones fell from the great chimney, half hiding the black, writhing limbs, at which the flames were eating in elemental fury. Burning beams crashed down from the roof and thundered on the stones, and the whole heap was enveloped by a roaring burst of fire. Flames were racing down the stair when Conan reached it. He caught up the fainting child under one arm and dragged Belisa to her feet. Through the crackle and snap of the fire sounded the splintering of the door under the war axes. He glared about, sighted a door opposite the stair landing, and hurried through it, carrying Tina and half-dragging Belisa, who seemed dazed. As they came into the chamber beyond, a reverberation behind them announced that the roof was falling in the hall. Through a strangling wall of smoke, Conan saw an open outer door on the other side of the chamber. As he lugged his charges through it, he saw it sagged on broken hinges, lock and bolt snapped and splintered as if by some terrific force. "The black man came in by this door," Belisa sobbed hysterically. "I saw him, but I did not know." They emerged into the fire-lit compound, a few feet from the hut row that lined the south wall. A Pict was skulking toward the door, eyes red in the firelight, axe lifted. Tossing the girl on his arm away from the blow, Conan drove his cutlass through the savage's breast, and then, sweeping Belisa off her feet, ran toward the south wall, carrying both girls. The compound was full of billowing smoke clouds that hid half the red work going on there. But the fugitives had been seen. Naked figures, black against the dull glare, pranced out of the smoke, brandishing gleaming axes. They were still yards behind him when Conan ducked into the spaces between the huts and the wall. At the other end of the corridor he saw other howling shapes running to cut him off. Halting short, he tossed Belisa bodily to the firing ledge and leaped after her. Swinging her over the palisade, he dropped her into the sand outside and dropped Tina after her. A thrown axe crashed into a log by his shoulder, and then he too was over the wall and gathering up his dazed and helpless charges. When the Picts reached the wall, the space before the palisade was empty of all except the dead. Chapter 7. A Pirate Returns to the Sea. Dawn was tinging the dim waters with an old rose hue. Far out across the tinted waters, a fleck of white grew out of the mist, a sail that seemed to hang suspended in the pearly sky. On a bushy headland, Conan the Cimmerian held a ragged cloak over a fire of green wood. As he manipulated the cloak, puffs of smoke rose upward, quivered against the dawn, and vanished. Belisa crouched near him, one arm about Tina. "Do you think they'll see it and understand?" "They'll see it right enough," he assured her. "They've been hanging off and on this coast all night, hoping to sight some survivors. They're scared stiff. There's only half a dozen of them, and not one can navigate well enough to sail from here to the Barachan Isles. They'll understand my signals. It's the pirate code. I'm telling them that the captains are dead, and all the sailors, and for them to come inshore and take us aboard. They know I can navigate, and they'll be glad to ship under me. They'll have to. I'm the only captain left." "But suppose the Picts see the smoke?" She shuddered, glancing back over the misty sands and bushes to where, miles to the north, a column of smoke stood up in the still air. "They're not likely to see it. After I hid you in the woods, I crept back and saw them dragging barrels of wine and ale out of the storehouses. Already most of them were reeling. They'll all be lying around too drunk to move by this time. If I had 100 men, I could wipe out the whole horde. Look, there goes a rocket from the Red Hand. That means they're coming to take us off." Conan stamped out the fire, handed the cloak back to Belisa, and stretched like a great lazy cat. Belisa watched him in wonder. His unperturbed manner was not assumed. The night of fire and blood and slaughter, and the flight through the black woods afterward, had left his nerves untouched. He was as calm as if he had spent the night in feast and revel. Belisa did not fear him. She felt safer than she had felt since she landed on that wild coast. He was not like the freebooters, civilized men who had repudiated all standards of honor and lived without any. Conan, on the other hand, lived according to the code of his people, which was barbaric and bloody, but at least upheld its own peculiar standards of honor. "Do you think he is dead?" she asked, with seeming irrelevancy. He did not ask her to whom she referred. "I believe so. Silver and fire are both deadly to evil spirits, and he got a bellyful of both." Neither spoke of that subject again. Belisa's mind shrank from the task of conjuring up the scene when a black figure skulked into the great hall, and a long-delayed vengeance was horribly consummated. "What will you do when you get back to Zingara?" Conan asked. She shook her head helplessly. "I do not know. I have neither money nor friends. I am not trained to earn my living. Perhaps it would have been better had one of those arrows struck my heart." "Do not say that, my lady," begged Tina. "I will work for us both." Conan drew a small leather bag from inside his girdle. "I didn't get Tothmekri's jewels," he rumbled, "but here are some baubles I found in the chest where I got the clothes I'm wearing." He spilled a handful of flaming rubies into his palm. They're worth a fortune in themselves. He dumped them back into the bag and handed it to her. "But I can't take these," she began. "Of course you'll take them. I might as well leave you for the Picts to scalp as to take you back to Zingara to starve," said he. "I know what it is to be penniless in a Hyborian land. Now, in my country, sometimes there are famines, but people are hungry only when there's no food in the land at all. But in civilized countries, I've seen people sick of gluttony while others were starving. I've seen men fall and die of hunger against the walls of shops and storehouses crammed with food. Sometimes I was hungry too, but then I took what I wanted at sword's point. But you can't do that, so you take these rubies. You can sell them and buy a castle, and slaves and fine clothes, and with them it won't be hard to get a husband, because civilized men all desire wives with these possessions." "But what of you?" Conan grinned and indicated the Red Hand drawing swiftly inshore. "A ship and a crew are all I want, As soon as I set foot on that deck, I'll have a ship, and as soon as I can raise the Barashans, I'll have a crew. The lads of the Red Brotherhood are eager to ship with me because I always lead them to rare loot, and as soon as I've set you and the girl ashore on the Zingaran coast, I'll show the dogs some looting. Nay, no thanks. What are a handful of gems to me when all the loot of the southern seas will be mine for the grasping? Thank you for listening. If you like our recordings, consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel so you don't miss any more audiobooks.